All right. Maybe too easy. All right. The mucous membrane consists of all the following except. Correct answer is serosa. The mucous membrane is the layer that faces the lumen. Serosa is on the opposite side. The outermost layer of the esophageal wall consists of, the correct answer is D in adventitia. Number 3, parietal cells secrete which of the following? They say high. So the correct answer is hydrochloric acid, an intrinsic factor, that equals D. Number 4, which of the following structures are located within the ileum? The correct answer is Peyer's patches. Submucosa. Which of the following are carried into the duodenum by the pancreatic duct? Amylase and lipase. We said that those are used for digestion of carbohydrates and fats, respectively. Whereas insulin's a hormone, it's released in the bloodstream. Number 6, all the organs in the small intestine possess. The correct answer is both villi and Peristalsis. Runner's glands are unique to the duodenum.
So what was that, D?
Yeah. Number 7, enterokinase is produced by small intestines. It's located along their brush border. Number 8, which of the following organs has or have a mesentery? When they have a mesentery, you have to be intraperitoneal. So the correct answer is J2. B. Number 9, which of the following chemical substances triggers contraction of the gallbladder and increased delivery of pancreatic secretions into the duodenum? That's our old friend cholecystokinin. D. Number 10, salivary amylase is an enzyme that begins the chemical digestion of
carbohydrates.
Yes. And then finally, name the 4 major layers that comprise the wall of an organ within the GI tract. That would be you could either say mucosa or mucous membrane, same thing. Submucosa, muscularis externa, and then finally either a serosa or adventitia.
You know what messed me up?
I got like
do not
2 points.
do the layers. Like, what do you
Do
mean?
not, like, for instance, I don't want you to give me the individual layers of the mucosa. I'm appropriate muscularis mucosa.
Oh.
So the major, when it says major, that's what this means.
I
Okay.
got a couple points on that.
So hopefully everybody got 100%.
Yeah.
Wait, almost 5 and 7.
I could
What
have,
did everyone
but
say?
I don't know if I got all.
D&D.
Written.
All right. I'm going to show you something. We said the small intestine is the major digestive and absorptive organs. That all those digestive enzymes from the pancreas, the small intestine, bind to the nutrients within the GI tract and mediate chemical digestion. And then the building blocks get absorbed. I've drawn here the biliary system here. What is this duct called here? System. What is this one called right here? Common bowel duct. And then what is this bad boy called? Pancreatic. Ampulla of Vater. No, that's not the opening. It's this combined. In other words, when the common bowel duct meets the pancreatic duct, they form a larger structure called the ampulla vata. An ampulla is a dilated passageway. So when the two meet, the common structure becomes larger. It's the ampulla vata. Now, it raises a little nipple on the mucosal surface of the duodenum. That's called the major duodenal papilla. Part of the reason for that nipple-like projection is the fact that there's a cup of smooth muscle that surrounds the opening. What is that cup of smooth muscle called? The sphincter of Oddi. The sphincter of Oddi. Now, sometimes some people will develop gallstones that precipitate within the gallbladder. And sometimes these gallstones get excreted like this into the biliary tree. And they can become lodged or stuck like this, blocking passage of bile. What do you think is going to happen in terms of the digestive system if you block the passage of bile into the small intestine? Anybody? It's going to do what? What's going to happen in terms of digestive activity if you have a gallstone that's lodged within the common bile duct that's blocking movement of bile?
Bilirubin.
It can cause bilirubinemia, yeah. In other words, that conjugated bilirubin can leak out into the bloodstream, and that can cause jaundice. That's correct. What else? In terms of digestive activity now.
It's going to slow it down.
Fat, yeah, something to do with fat. You will not be able to emulsify fat. Remember how we said you have this big old fat globule here if you've eaten a fatty meal?
Yeah.
And that's right. And it has to be emulsified. It has to be broken down into smaller droplets which can be suspended within the intestinal fluid. That's the purpose of bile. If you can't emulsify it, then the lipase coming in from the pancreas doesn't have access to most of the fat molecules, most of the triglycerides. So that, as a result, if you can't emulsify the fat, most of that fat goes undigested. And it continues down all the way into the large intestine and into your stool. We talked about this. So you develop fatty stools. Okay? We call that steatorrhea. Okay.
Would that be like hard to pass?
Oh no, they're easy to pass. They're easy to pass. But yeah. These are greasy. These tend to be greasy, gassy stools. And they float at the top of the water bowl, toilet bowl. Why is that? Why do they float? Because oil and water, fat and water don't mix. They'll kill each other. So these stools float. They're very foul smelling. And they don't have that nice, kind of beautiful brown sheen that most stools have. They're kind of chocolatey. Instead, they're clay colored. They're more like the color, I guess, of the wall. A very, very light color. Why are they clay colored?
Because of all that.
Because there's no bottom.
Well, yeah, there's no bilirubin, okay? And bilirubin is broken down and converted to stercobilin by bacteria, and the stercobilin gives the stool its brown color. So if you don't have any bilirubin reaching the small intestine, there's nothing for bacteria to act upon to create the stercobilin that causes that color of the stool that you notice. Okay? Now I'm going to pose one other question to you. Many times these patients will develop easy bruising and bleeding, and bruisability. Why would these people bruise easily and develop problems with bleeds? Yes, true. Are you okay?
I
don't. What's that?
They're lacking.
That's it.
They're lacking.
What do you need to produce clotting factors?
Oh, right.
What's that?
Isn't it
What vitamins?
Vitamin
A,
B?
D, E, and K?
From the liver.
All right, so do you need A, D, E, and K to produce clotting factors?
Okay.
Which one do you need?
Isn't it
K. So why are these patients lacking vitamin K?
They're not getting the potassium.
Amy don't even know she's fat. Okay, it's a fat-soluble vitamin. Okay, so that means it's absorbed with fat. If there's no fat absorption, there's no vitamin K absorption. So without K, the liver can't produce 4 of your clotting factors, 2, 7, 9, and 10. Okay, So you develop hypocoagulability. You bleed or bruise easily.
2 what?
2, 7, 9, 10. Now, so a lack of bile will cause malabsorption of fat, leading to steatorrhea. By the way, if your pancreas wasn't producing lipase, you'd also develop steatorrhea. In this case, you could emulsify the fat, but without lipase, you can't chemically digest it. In other words, break it down into fatty acids that can be absorbed. We talked about fat absorption being different from the absorption of the building blocks of carbohydrates, monosaccharides, and the absorption of amino acids. Can anybody tell me a couple ways in which fat absorption is different? Right, that fats in the form of what? What are those, that larger particle called, where you have the fats coated with protein?
Triglyceride.
What is that called?
Is it triglyceride?
Well, it's a fat and triglyceride are synonymous. They're the same thing. But remember that when fats are absorbed, okay, what happens is along these cells that line the mucosa, the fatty acids come in, the glycerol comes in, and they're reassembled into triglycerides. And these triglycerides get coated with protein. What do we call that particle carrying fat and protein? Chylomicron. It's called a chylomicron. And these chylomicrons, instead of passing into the vascular capillaries, they pass into a lacteal.
Right.
Okay? Now, that lacteal is simply a lymphatic capillary within the mucosa of the GI tract. It's got a special name. In fact, its contents, instead of being called lymph, we call it chyle. C-H-Y-L-E. So that chyle, that fat-laden lymph, is carried back to the bloodstream via the thoracic duct. So we said if you were to take a blood sample following a fatty meal, spin down the blood, you'd know that the plasma looked milky. You'd see that the plasma looked milky because it was chock full of chylomicrons. Let's look for a second at the pancreas. In AP1, you may not remember this, but we said that the pancreas is unique in that it is both an exocrine and an endocrine organ. Okay? Now, so that the exocrine glands that make up the pancreas, by definition, exocrine glands have ducts. Okay? These glands, which are grape-like clusters, right here, look. These little grape-like clusters produce digestive enzymes which enter via a duct into the pancreatic duct. So they pass from a smaller duct into a larger duct, and then they're carried into the lumen of the small intestine. So these glands, okay, they're part of the exocrine pancreas. Now these glands, because they're producing watery secretions with enzymes, digestive enzymes, they're serous glands, which means they're darker staining. They have nice round nuclei. Okay. By definition, they're producing secretions that are carried by a duct. Okay. That makes them exocrine. But in addition, the pancreas also has little islands of cells, here and here and here, called islets of Langerhans. And Langerhans has an S at the end, but we don't pronounce it. This is another one of those German words. Langerhans. Islets of Langerhans. These islets of Langerhans contain endocrine cells. Endocrine cells, cells that produce hormones. In fact, there are 4 major cell types: alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Okay? The alpha cells within the islets of Langerhans. And these are lighter staining clusters of cells. They look like little islands of light staining cells surrounded by a sea of serous glands, acinar glands. Acinar means in grape-like clusters. Okay? These lighter staining regions contain alpha cells that produce a hormone called glucagon. And they contain beta cells that produce a hormone called insulin. Okay? Now, by virtue of the fact that these are hormones, they're not carried by the pancreatic duct. By definition, a hormone enters directly into the bloodstream. See, these endocrine structures here are ductless. They don't have a duct that connects them to the duodenum. They release their secretions, their hormones, directly into the bloodstream. Last class, we said that both the pancreas and the liver are important in glucose metabolism and maintaining stable glucose levels within the blood. Okay? The reason that one of the reasons the liver is important is because the liver can store glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose. The reason the pancreas is important is that it produces these hormones, glucagon and insulin. Okay? Don't confuse glucagon with glycogen. If I ask on a test, what hormone does the alpha cells produce? Don't tell me glycogen. It's glucagon. And insulin and glucagon. Right. The endocrine portion. Okay? And so, glucagon and insulin are going to regulate glucose levels within the blood. So that's why the pancreas is important in glucose metabolism. I'm going to erase this in just a second. All right. Let's suppose the x-axis is a timeline. 6 a.m., noon, 6 p.m. This correlates with breakfast, lunch, supper. And the y-axis represents glucose levels. Let's say normal fasting glucose is 100 or less here. Okay? Then what you're going to find is if you eat breakfast, lunch, and supper, that breakfast, your glucose levels can climb. With lunch. Same thing. Okay? Because what you're doing is you're breaking down carbohydrates, releasing glucose into the lumen of the small intestine, and that glucose gets absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, the reason that the glucose levels come down is that hyperglycemia, we're seeing right here, hyperglycemia. That means an elevated glucose level within the bloodstream. Hyperglycemia triggers the release of insulin from those islets of Langerhans, from those beta cells. Okay? So that as glucose levels climb, if we use the red marker here to indicate insulin levels, you're going to see that as glucose levels climb, insulin follows. Insulin levels begin to go up, shadowing glucose levels. Okay? So hyperglycemia, elevated glucose levels, are the trigger for release of insulin. And what insulin does is it facilitates the uptake of glucose from the bloodstream into cells. So because as insulin levels climb, glucose gets shunted from the blood into cells, you see that the glucose levels begin to fall in response to that insulin. Now, there are some people who have an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune means their immune system attacks self. And we talked about autoimmune diseases before.
A little bit.
Have you ever heard of that? That your own immune system fighting yourself. It's kind of almost contradictory. It doesn't make sense. Okay? It's like Isella, when you were young, and your little brother would kind of grab your hand like this, and he would say, "Why are you hitting yourself? Okay? You're attacking yourself. Why are you doing that?" Okay, he's actually forcing you to do that. I don't know if you realize that. But that's kind of like autoimmune. You're attacking your own tissues. So it's an abnormality. In this autoimmune disease, the body attacks, the immune system attacks the beta cells within the islets of pancreas, the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, and you impair the ability to produce insulin. That's called diabetes mellitus, type 1. Okay? So those patients who have diabetes, what they have to do is they may have to give themselves a little injection for each meal. An injection of short-acting insulin. That's going to mimic the activity of a normal pancreas. Everybody with me there? Okay. Now, what happens here? What happens if you have your breakfast? I always think of the breakfast as the most important meal of the day. And then you're doing other important stuff, and things happen during the course of the day, and you don't get a chance to eat lunch. And your glucose levels begin to fall like this. Because it's being utilized by cells. Okay? Then you can become hypoglycemic. Then your blood sugar levels can fall too low. Okay? Whereas we said that hyperglycemia is going to stimulate release of insulin, hypoglycemia is going to stimulate the alpha cells in the islets to release glucagon. One of the things that glucagon does is it binds the cells within the liver and triggers the breakdown of glycogen. So that the glycogen is broken down into glucose subunits that are released into the blood. And when that glucose gets released into the blood, what happens? Its levels come back up. Okay? It doesn't necessarily peak like that, but it's going to come back up to baseline. Okay, so that's the result of the activity of glucagon. So neither the insulin or the glucagon are carried by the pancreatic duct because those are hormones. However, pancreatic amylase, pancreatic lipase, and all the pancreatic proteases or peptidases, like trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, procarboxypeptidase, all of those digestive enzymes are carried by the pancreatic duct. Okay, so let's look at this slideshow here. I think we've looked at a lot of this. Just keep going on. There's our pancreas. We talked about the surface modifications of the small intestine, weak eye circularity, villi, microvilli. There's your Myers patches. That's ileum. We talked about the liver and the blood flow. Oh, here we go. This is a section, a microscopic section through the pancreas. Now, when we cut a microscopic section through the pancreas, all of these little cross-sections are cross-sections of cells that make up the exocrine pancreas. These represent those little grape-like clusters, but instead of seeing the whole three-dimensional grape, we're just cutting right through them. Okay? So these are called acinar units. They're little clusters, rounded clusters of cells that are producing hormones. Not hormones, digestive enzymes. Okay? And so there's a little duct in some of them. You see a little opening, a space in the center of those cells that are going to carry the digestive enzymes. So these darker staining cells here, these are all part of the exocrine pancreas. Okay? They form little acinar secretory units. These lighter staining islands here are your islets of Langerhans. These contain the alpha, the beta, the gamma, and the delta cells that have a endocrine function. All right, I showed you this list of digestive enzymes, what they do and where they're formed. Now we're going to move to the large intestine. So we've covered the small intestine, we've covered its relationship to the pancreas and the liver. Okay. Talked about the gallbladder, the fact that it stores and concentrates bile. As food moves from the duodenum to the jejunum and then into the ileum, it's going to eventually pass from the ileum into the large intestine. Notice that the opening from the ileum into the large intestine is associated with a little nipple-like projection. Again, it's caused by a cup of smooth muscle that makes up a sphincter that controls movement of nutrients from the ileum into the large intestine. This is called the Ileocecal Valve. Some of you will be able to find this on the dog, this Ileocecal Valve. Now, below the opening from the ileum, this sac-like portion of the large intestine is called the cecum. We talked about that, right? Cecum, and you shall find. The vermiform appendix hangs from the end of the cecum. Everything above this junction makes up the colon. And the colon can be subdivided into several sections. This part here that moves upward toward the liver is called the ascending colon. It transitions into a transverse colon. At the spleen, it turns. This part's called the descending colon. Okay. In the left lower quadrant, it becomes the sigmoid colon. I have an S shape here. And then the distalmost portion here, rectum. At the very end of the rectum, you have this anal canal, which opens into an anus. So those are the regions, the parts of the large intestine. Now, you already know that the superior mesenteric artery serves the right half of the colon. In other words, it serves the ascending colon and the proximal transverse. The inferior mesenteric artery is going to pick up the distal transverse, descending, sigmoid, and rectum. So the inferior mesenteric artery serves the left half of the colon and rectum. The rectum is unique in that it has two sources of blood flow, both the inferior mesenteric artery as well as the internal iliac. The rectum. Rectum. All right. Now, notice that the sigmoid colon is showing it here with a mesenteric. And look, the transverse colon has a mesenteric. So what it tells you is that the ascending part of the colon is retroperitoneal. But when it transitions into the transverse colon, it moves forward toward you into the peritoneal cavity and picks up this mesentery that we call a transverse mesocolon. Distally, it moves back retroperitoneal before forming the descending colon. So the descending colon has no mesentery. It's retroperitoneal. But when it transitions into sigmoid, again it moves forward, picking up a mesentery, which would be called the sigmoid mesocolon. The rectum sits below the peritoneal cavity. It is extraperitoneal, so it has no mesentery. Now, when we dissect the abdominal cavity. Oh, let me go back and say this. This turn here, this 90-degree turn where we go from ascending to transverse, you can either call that the right colon flexure, or more commonly it's called the hepatic flexure, because it occurs just below the liver. Hepatic flexure. No, it's just called, you can either call it the right colon flexure or the hepatic flexure. Now, at the end of the transverse colon, where it transitions into descending, takes this turn, you can either call that the left colon flexure, or more commonly, what we want in here, splenic flexure. So you have your hepatic and splenic flexures. When we open up the peritoneal cavity of the dog, some people will ask me, Professor, how do we differentiate the small intestine from the large intestine? It all looks the same to me. Okay, that's what I get a lot. It all looks the same to me. There are crucial differences. Okay? Some big differences. Okay? Number one, the large intestine, it's called the large intestine. It has a larger diameter than the small intestine. Okay? I shouldn't have to say that. The other thing is that the large intestine is subdivided into little segments. Okay? These are called, each segment is called a haustrum. If we want to use the plural, haustra, haustra coli. Okay? So the large intestine is segmented. Now, the segmentation is due to smooth muscle tone. So this segmentation is not as evident when you look at a dead animal. But if I show you an x-ray of the colon, you'll see it. Okay? A second major difference between large and small is that remember that you have 4 different layers within the wall. Okay. Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and then the serosa or connective tissue. Well, the large intestine has a typical muscularis externa with an intercircular and an outer longitudinal layer. But the outer longitudinal layer doesn't completely encircle the wall. The outer longitudinal layer is broken down into 3 bands. So it's not continuous all the way around the tubular structure. Instead, it's broken into 3 bands that are called Tinea coli. Let's get that written down. Here we go. Tinea coli. These are these bands composed of that longitudinal layer of the muscularis externa. Whereas in other organs, this longitudinal layer would completely encircle this loop of bowel. In the large intestine, no. It's broken down into 3 little groups of fibers called Tinea coli. So that's the second major difference between large and small. Haustra coli, Tinea coli. A third difference is that hanging off the serosal surface, you have these little sacs made up of visceral peritoneum containing fat. They have different names. People use different names, but I'm going to give you the name we're going to use. Epiploic. E-P-I-P-L-O-I-C. Epiploic appendages. So, little tiny sacs of visceral peritoneum containing fat. Microscopically. No, let's talk about gross appearance also. Let's go all the way down the rectum. Let's travel down the rectum toward the anal canal. Let's pretend we're on a journey. Okay?
I was really thinking that.
Now, along the anal canal, we find two sphincters that control defecation or movement of feces from the inside to the out. This internal anal sphincter is made up of smooth muscle, but it's supported externally by an external anal sphincter that is made up exclusively of skeletal muscle and is under voluntary control. Okay. Let me say something about peristalsis, smooth muscle contraction within the large intestine. Remember, the smooth muscle that lines these tubular organs, small intestine, large intestine, it contracts in waves. And these waves of contraction move the contents forward from point A to point B, always toward the anus. Okay. Oftentimes, if a part of the small and large intestine becomes distended by its contents, that will trigger peristalsis. So that if fecal content accumulates within the rectal valve, that distension is going to trigger contraction of the smooth muscle and relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. So it will trigger an urge to defecate. Okay? Now, the reason you don't necessarily defecate is because you're contracting your external anal sphincter. I know some of you have been in a situation where you've gone to a nice restaurant, maybe you've eaten a little bit more than you should have, and you're driving home and you feel your rectal valve beginning to fill up a little bit. In fact, so much so that you have an urge to defecate. Maybe your internal sphincter is beginning to relax. Well, you may not want to have a bowel movement in your car. So what you do is you clamp down. You contract that external anal sphincter and hope that you don't catch any red lights. If you do catch a red light, you kind of loosen your pants a little bit and clamp down a little bit more. Okay? Your goal is to wait till you get home and run to the bathroom before then you relax that external anal sphincter. Now, when you do get to the bathroom and you sit down, okay, you're going to relax that external anal sphincter, and then you perform what's called a Valsalva Maneuver. Okay, to perform a Valsalva Maneuver, you don't need a nursing license. Okay? The only thing you do is contract your abdominal muscles against a closed glottis. Okay, you keep your vocal cords together, so it causes a buildup of intra-abdominal pressure. And that increased intra-abdominal pressure is going to help to compress the rectum while you relax the external anal sphincter. And so all of a sudden, you're going to feel relief because you're evacuating your rectum. Okay? That's called a Valsalva Maneuver. We all do it. It comes natural. Okay? You don't need any type of certification. A hernia can occur anywhere. A hernia, for instance, you can have herniation of the brain. A hernia just means displacement of tissue from the compartment where it belongs into some other space. What kind of hernia are we referring to now? Because I'm talking about a rectal hernia. Not sure what you're referring to there. I'll give you an example of a hernia. Let's suppose there's rectal prolapse. That's not a hernia. Well, hernia. Now, let's suppose you herniate part of the stomach into the space.
Hemorrhoid?
Yeah, that's not right. Okay, we'll come back to that though, because you mentioned hernia. Let's say you push. Let's say part of your stomach herniates above the diaphragm. Okay, like this. You get strapped like this. Well, that's called a hiatal hernia. Hiatal because you're pushing the stomach through the esophageal hiatus. Okay? Hiatal hernia, but we're displacing tissue that belongs below the diaphragm. We're pushing it into a different space. So that's a herniation. Okay. Now, hemorrhoids can often be triggered by increased venous pressure. So if you strain a lot, and that's going to cause an increase in the pressure within the veins of the rectum, that's going to cause them to become dilated. Okay? And it can cause those hemorrhoids that you're talking about. In fact, if those dilated veins bust, then you have a bleeding hemorrhoid. Pregnancy. Because of the increased abdominal pressure associated with the gravid uterus, that increases venous pressure. You know, veins that are returning up toward the heart. And so that can lead to hemorrhoids. The hemorrhoids are just dilated rectal veins. Okay. This is the microscopic appearance of the colon. Notice again we have simple columnar epithelium that's going to form very straight tubular glands. These are mostly simple tubular glands that descend down into the lamina propria. Okay. The thing about the rectum, and this is true about the large intestine, because this looks like the large intestine as well, the rest of the large intestine, is that almost every cell is a goblet cell. Whereas in the small intestine, you have scattered goblet cells throughout the epithelium. In the large intestine, almost every cell is a goblet cell. And these cells vaginate down and form straight tubular glands like this into the lamina propria. This would be the muscularis mucosa. This would be your submucosa. This would be the inner layer of the muscularis externa. We don't see an outer layer because it's, oh, here's one. Okay, because it's restricted to 3 bands called tini coli. Okay, and then you're going to either have a cirrhosis or an adventitia, depending upon what part of the colon of the rectum we're talking about. The appendix is part of the large intestine. So it has the same makeup. It's got a simple columnar epithelium made up mostly of goblet cells, and then you see these intestinal glands. Now, some books will call the intestinal glands in the large intestine crypts of Leverkusen, just like we do for the small intestine. I like to differentiate. The intestinal glands in the small intestine we'll call crypts of Leverkusen, or the intestinal glands in the large intestine we'll simply call them intestinal glands. The appendix is different from the rest of the large intestine because within its submucosa and lamina propria, you see lots of lymph follicles. This is the germinal center. That's the germinal center. So they encircle the lumen of the appendix. And it makes sense because the appendix sits near the junction of the large intestine with the small intestine. We said the large intestine is chock full of bacteria, the small intestine not so much. So anytime you have an interface between the outer world and the inner world, you're going to find more lymph tissue, in this case lymph follicles. This would be analogous to the lymph follicles in the ileum, where they're called Peyer's patches. We don't call these Peyer's patches. We just call them groups of lymph follicles. Okay? Or we can refer to this as MALT, which means mucosa, because these are in the mucosa-associated lymph tissue. In fact, Peyer's patches are part of MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue.
Dr. Brown, what causes your appendix to burst?
Usually a fecal lift. A fecal lift is a very hard piece of stool that gets caught in the neck of the appendix so that it can't drain. So then it can become distended, its blood flow can become compromised. Okay. It begins to become ischemic and break down. During that process, it becomes inflamed and painful. This is a view. I like this view here. This is a sagittal view of the peritoneal cavity. In yellow here, this is parietal peritoneum. Okay, surrounding each loop of intestine, you have visceral peritoneum, and these connections here make up mesenteric. Now, notice here that this is the rectum. The rectum sits below, here's the peritoneal cavity here. This is the border of the peritoneal cavity. The rectum sits below the peritoneal cavity. It is extraperitoneal. So the rectum is not going to have a mesentery. It's not going to have a serosa. It will have an adventitia. When you open up the dog, you'll notice that here's the transverse colon. So this mesenteric connection is the transverse mesocolon. Here's the jejunum. It's coming out from the retroperitoneal space, and the ileum. They're going to have a traditional mesentery. And these mesenteries are going to carry blood vessels to the organs. Here, this extension of serous membrane, it hangs down below the stomach and transverse colon. This is the greater omentum. How'd y'all do? We all able to follow all that? Listening up and doing some good reading make you an expert in GI tract. Now, last time I believe we looked at the esophagus and we looked at part of the mouth, the tongue, I think, with the papilla, right? So let's go and let's look at some of the other organs under the microscope. Great.